After the critical and financial success of Iron Man, the newly formed Marvel Studios discovered that they had created a cash cow out of Iron Man and wasted no time to get to work on the sequel. Jon Favreau returned to direct, as well as most of the main cast of actors, with a new screenwriter. I have a bit of personal history with this film because I was kind of on the young side at the time of Iron Man 2's release, and I remember this movie being probably the first piece of entertainment that I had sustained hype for like an extended period of time, like 3 months before it released. I really liked Marvel Comics at the time, and the last Marvel theatrical release had been X-Men Origins Wolverine, which had been released about a year before Iron Man 2, so I was ready for a good comic book movie. Now, I was aware that there were some other superhero movies in the theaters between those two movies, like Watchmen and Kick-Ass, but like I said, I was kind of on the young side at the time, so those films would not have been accessible for me or appropriate. And I was also a mainline Marvel guy, so those other movies didn't seem especially interesting to me anyway. This movie, compared to the rest of the MCU, is probably skippable, but still a pretty solid film. This film has a reputation by the fans to be the worst of the MCU, but it's not as bad as some fans make it out to be. It picks up on the themes from the first film, and it develops them further, like how the US government and the rest of the world reacts to what Tony Stark is doing with Iron Man, and the duality between Tony Stark's personal identity and his identity as Iron Man. Iron Man 2 also introduces some other recurring heroes for the MCU, so there's some fun comic book setup for the future of the cinematic universe, which some people criticize as getting in the way, but I find that it fits in with and develops the story of the movie. Basically not the most necessary viewing, but satisfying nonetheless. Now I'm moving into the spoiler section, where I'll go through the plot, so you have been warned. The movie's opening scene catches us up with the first film and shows us what has happened in the time in between the first film through magazine covers and articles that Ivan Vanko, or Whiplash, a main antagonist, has pinned up on the wall. We see that Iron Man has made a big impact. While Anton Vanko, Ivan's father, is dying, he tells Ivan that he should be in Tony's place, rich, famous, and respected. Ivan pulls out a blueprint of an arc reactor that has the name of his father and Tony's father on it, and starts to build the miniaturized version Tony has. Then we cut to Tony flying in for his presentation at his Stark Technology Expo, where he recaps some of the last film, and that the world is more peaceful than it ever has for the longest period of time since Iron Man has shown up, and that his expo is an example of Stark's legacy to the world, that his company's technology will be passed on to the rest of the world and leave it in a better shape. As it turns out, Tony's concerned about his legacy because his arc reactor that keeps him alive is slowly poisoning him. Then Tony gets sued by the government over the Iron Man suit. They see it as a threatening, specialized weapon, and that potentially more good can be done with it if more people have access to it. Justin Hammer, a weapons contractor for the military, testifies against Tony. Hammer is established as a rival for Tony, which is pretty much explicitly stated in an interview. He wants the fame, fortune, and respect Tony has within the same industry, but he isn't as brilliant, charming, or witty as Tony. Hammer even disastrously tries to recreate Iron Man suits, which Tony puts on display at the Senate hearing. As a result, Hammer's contract with the military gets revoked. So Hammer basically ends up being a useless annoyance that has been embarrassed, and his company has taken a hit because of Tony Stark. Of course, Tony won't hand his suits over for reasons established in the last movie about his weapons falling into the wrong people's hands, and only trusting himself to do the right thing with it. Rhodey is reintroduced in this same scene to represent the military's interest, played by a new actor in the role, Don Cheadle, which is classily acknowledged. I like Don Cheadle better than the previous actor, by the way. His comedic timing with Robert Downey Jr. is a little better, and he improves on his performance with each subsequent film. Rhodey supports Iron Man's efforts, and proposes to fold Iron Man into the military's chain of command. A nice idea, and gives Rhodey unique characterization, trying to compromise between the government and the vigilante. Tony of course refuses, not wanting to relinquish any of his control, suiting that the suit is part of him, and that the government doesn't need it because he has successfully privatized world peace, he's a nuclear deterrent, and that there aren't any threats that the government couldn't deal with without his suits. Basically, the world's in the best shape than it has ever been because of him, and the government won't make anything better by using his suits. Because Tony wants to focus on his business as Iron Man and the Stark Expo, he promotes Pepper to CEO, as she's already been running the company for a while. Tony calls her his successor. Tony also donates his art collection. I'm skeptical that Pepper wouldn't wonder that something was amiss with Tony, giving away his art collection, calling her his successor, talking about his legacy. Those seem like they should arouse suspicion that Tony is preparing for some change, like maybe death? But there's subtle signs, and it's possible that Pepper, even as shrewd as she is, to not catch on. But they've known each other for so long, so it seems like she's being dumbed down a little. Now, who is it that presents Tony and Pepper with the papers to sign over the position of CEO? It's none other than Natasha Romanoff, or Black Widow as she's better known as. Undercover as a notary from the Stark Industries legal department. To be honest, the first time I saw this movie, I didn't realize Black Widow was in this film. She doesn't go by Black Widow in this film. Her real name, Romanoff, is only mentioned once. She wears a regular S.H.I.E.L.D. spy uniform instead of her comic book costume, and she doesn't wear her iconic red hourglass symbol. This isn't a problem. I like that the Easter eggs and character introductions are subtle, but I didn't know about them for a while, so maybe it's a little too subtle. Black Widow appeals to all Tony's desires, and Tony offers her a job to fill Pepper's shoes as his personal assistant. As Tony's blood toxicity gets higher, his behavior starts to get more reckless, and he steps in for the Stark Industries-sponsored race car driver to race in Monaco. And while he's racing, Vanko ambushes Tony on the track with his whiplash suit. Luckily, Pepper and Happy get Tony's briefcase Iron Man suit to him in time, and he narrowly escapes with his life. Then Tony confronts Vanko in prison. Vanko feels robbed of the success his father deserved, after Tony's father, Howard Stark, deported Vanko's father for secretly selling Stark weapons to the Russians during the Cold War. Then the Russians threw Vanko's father in jail for not being able to deliver on the Stark weapons. Vanko's idea is that if you can make God bleed, then people will cease to believe in him, and when there's blood in the water, the sharks will come. Vanko also knows that the palladium in Tony's reactor will kill him, so basically, he's trying to ruin Stark's reputation as a peacekeeping deterrent and his legacy, so that when the palladium kills Tony, he isn't as important in the people of the world's memory, trying to enact revenge through a similar method to what happened to his family. However, Hammer notices that Vanko and his own goals align. He wants to upstage Tony with technology that could replace Stark's, and Hammer breaks Vanko out of prison. Vanko's plan starts to take effect almost immediately as the world starts to doubt if Iron Man can protect them after seeing Tony's erratic behavior and his vulnerability to whiplash. Then at Tony's birthday party, his behavior becomes more erratic as his blood toxicity continues to increase higher. He makes a fool of himself and recklessly uses the suit, which Pepper and Rhodey try to stop and end the party, but is only successful when Rhodey uses another Iron Man suit to stop Tony. The reason for the fight actually makes a lot of sense. Rhodey comes over trying to negotiate a deal between Tony and the military, then Rhodey finds Tony too irresponsible to have that much power. Interestingly enough, no one considers that Tony might be an alcoholic, or even that he is suffering some other mental disorder, which might be too easy for me to say because Tony's been an alcoholic in the comics. Rhodey doesn't want Tony to ruin his self-image or reputation, or the reputation of Iron Man, because he believes that Iron Man is a force of good, so he takes a suit for himself to force Tony to stop embarrassing himself even further. And Tony, being drunk and feeling intruded upon, retaliates. After the dust settles from their brawl, Rhodey flies off with the suit. It's later revealed that Tony had security in place that would not allow unauthorized use of the suits, so essentially, he let Rhodey take it. Which would also make sense. He's dying, and at least his legacy will extend to the military, and be on better terms with the government by authorizing a lieutenant access to a suit. It's an Iron Man being folded into the chain of command, like Rhodey was talking about during the court session. Now, a question I have which is sort of addressed is how the military isn't able to replicate the miniaturized arc reactor. A little later, Pepper talks about how Stark owns patents on the Iron Man technology, which could prevent replication, but that doesn't guarantee that the government won't secretly try and do it anyway. The government could reverse engineer an arc reactor, but it's a complex device and Tony probably has safeguards against that. Like, the device could self-destruct. This is extrapolating away from what we know in the movie, but Tony is concerned about his tech getting into the wrong hands. After all, he had safeguards so that the suits couldn't be accessed without authorization. It would be in character for Tony to make his arc reactors unreplicable without knowing the specs. Then Nick Fury shows up, we get some discussion about the Avengers, but the purpose of the meeting is to convey that Fury is displeased with the commotion related to Tony, you know, like Whiplash and Rhodey getting a suit. In the same scene, Black Widow is revealed to Tony as an undercover agent that S.H.I.E.L.D. sent to monitor his actions. S.H.I.E.L.D. was able to figure out that Tony's arc reactor is killing him, and then provide him with some of Howard Stark's research on it. Somehow, Fury knows about the secret element that Howard Stark discovered, even though information on it isn't explicitly in the chest. Fury confines Tony to his house with S.H.I.E.L.D. agents that won't let him leave so that he won't cause any more trouble until he improves his arc reactor. Then Tony watches a tape apparently alluding to the existence of a new element indicated through the layout of a diorama of the Stark Expo, which Tony picks up on despite it being really subtle and disguised in Howard's message. It sounds like the purpose of the Stark Expo was to pass on a legacy in the first place, because there's a lot Howard wasn't able to achieve due to technological limitations of the time, and he's leaving the company in a state for Tony to pick up where Howard left off. The layout of the buildings and the diorama is in the shape of an atom for the new element needed, which Tony picks up on. It's a convoluted way for the element to be disguised. I mean, how would Fury even know that there is a secret message about a new element on that tape in the first place? But it's a little more likely that Tony could notice it because he's a scientist and knows about atoms. It's still a stretch and a little hard to believe though. Meanwhile, Vanko hesitantly convinced Hammer to make drones instead of Iron Man suit replacements. I like the idea of them making drones because with a drone version of Iron Man, no human life is being put at risk, thereby making Iron Man irrelevant. But Vanko tells Hammer that the drones will only be able to salute for the demonstration at the Stark Expo, which upsets Hammer and he feels taken advantage of by Vanko. However, as the weapons contractor for the military, Hammer gets to arm the suit Rhodey took from Tony. The War Machine suit alone, Hammer feels is enough to make Iron Man unnecessary, because now the United States has one that can do Iron Man's job for him, and in the immediate interests of the country. Tony receives a call from Vanko telling him to go to the expo, which doesn't make sense, but I'll get to that later. During Hammer's demonstration, Iron Man shows up to try and prevent whatever disaster Vanko has planned. Then the drones try to kill Tony, which leads to Vanko eventually showing up and fighting because his drones get trashed and Widow was in pursuit of him after she interrogated Vanko's location out of Hammer. As with the last movie, the fight at the end feels tacked on, but this one is more contrived. Vanko wanted to ruin Tony's legacy, but if he kills Tony right now in the way that he does, it makes him a martyr. Rhodey realizes that despite Tony's irresponsibility and sometimes self-destructive behavior, that he can trust Tony to be dedicated to using his power for justice. Hammer gets arrested, Vanko has all his suits self-destruct because why not? And Tony saves Pepper from the explosion. Understandably, Pepper quits because of the danger and hassle Tony is. She's been having to do a lot of damage control PR from Tony's public incidents, but after realizing how much of a help she's been to Tony while he's been in a seemingly doomed state, she changes her mind. Then Fury tells Tony that based on Widow's assessment of him, that he's not recommended to be a member of the Avengers. However, Iron Man is accepted. Tony defends himself, blaming his deadly condition as the reason for his erratic behavior. The film concludes with Tony and Rhodey being awarded medals, and then it's over. But of course, there's a post-credit scene, which I didn't see on my first viewing, but by the Avengers, or the films after that, I am new to stay for them. I like this scene a lot because Thor has a pretty different setting in it from Iron Man, so it's cool to reinforce to audiences that these movies are connected. It tells us that S.H.I.E.L.D. will probably show up at some point in the Thor movie, and it's great marketing for Thor to show up in an Iron Man movie. To sum everything up, this movie is a lot better than it seems to be remembered as. Of course, most of the following films set a high standard for filmmaking in general, but this movie naturally progresses the characters and the world from the first film, and goes to interesting new places with them. It's a solid tale about if Tony should be allowed the power of Iron Man, and how Tony will create a legacy that's beneficial to the world. There are a few plot holes and contrivances, but it still naturally presents a bit of a thought-provoking argument through good characters. I give this film a 3.5 out of 5.